Millionaire woman finds homeless black man with her lost dog. What she offered him changed both their lives forever. The golden retriever's amber eyes held secrets that would unravel two lives in a single glance. One belonging to a woman who had everything money could buy, and another to a man who had lost everything but still chose kindness. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story. Because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across downtown Seattle as Rebecca Matthews pressed her manicured hand against her mouth, her heart hammering against her ribs as she leaned halfway out of her silver Tesla's driver-side window. The professional composure that had built her multi-million-dollar empire crumbled in an instant as she stared at the impossible sight before her. "Max," she whispered, the name escaping like a prayer she'd given up saying 3 years ago. Steve Williams looked up from where he sat against the concrete pillar, his weathered face creased with confusion as this elegant black woman in expensive business attire called out to him from her luxury car. But it wasn't him she was looking at. It was the golden retriever pressed against his side, the dog whose amber eyes had suddenly become alert, whose entire body had gone rigid with recognition. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Steve said gently, his voice carrying the careful politeness of someone who'd learned to navigate the uncomfortable space between his circumstances and other people's discomfort. "Is everything all right?" Rebecca's throat constricted. 3 years. 3 years of private investigators, missing pet websites, sleepless nights driving through every neighborhood in Seattle hoping for just a glimpse. 3 years of guilt that ate at her successful facade like acid, because she'd been the one working late that night when her housekeeper had accidentally left the back gate open. At 34, Rebecca had built Matthews Tech Solutions from a college dorm room idea into an empire, but success had come at a cost. 18-hour days, weekend meetings, a life so consumed with building wealth that she'd barely noticed how empty her penthouse apartment felt until Max disappeared. The golden retriever had been her one constant companion, the only living thing that greeted her unconditionally after those brutal days of corporate warfare. "That dog," she managed, her voice stronger now but still trembling. "What's his name?" Steve's protective instincts flickered. He'd been homeless for 3 years now, ever since the layoffs at Boeing had claimed his job as an aerospace engineer, and he'd learned to be cautious about people who showed sudden interest in the few things he had left. But there was something in this woman's voice, a raw pain that resonated with his own. "I call him Chance," Steve replied, his hand moving instinctively to rest on the dog's head. The golden retriever hadn't taken his eyes off Rebecca, his tail beginning a slow, tentative wag, as if testing a half-remembered dream. "Have you ever lost something so precious that finding it again felt impossible? What would you do if that moment of reunion finally came? Share your thoughts below." Rebecca's breath caught. She fumbled for her phone with shaking fingers, scrolling through the photos she'd kept all these years. "Look," she said, holding the device towards Steve. "Look at this picture." The image showed a younger version of the same golden retriever, sitting in what was clearly an expensive living room, wearing a blue collar with tags visible. But it was the dog's expression that made Steve's heart skip. That same intelligent gaze, the same slight tilt of the head, the way one ear flopped just a little more than the other. "His name is Max," Rebecca continued, her professional mask completely abandoned now. "He disappeared 3 years ago from my home in Queen Anne. I've been looking for him ever since." Steve felt the world shift beneath him. The dog he'd found limping and scared, the companion who'd kept him sane through the darkest period of his life, had belonged to someone else, had been loved by someone else, had been missed. "Ma'am, Steve started, but Chance, Max, suddenly stood up, took 3 tentative steps toward the car, and let out a soft whine that sounded like recognition wrapped in confusion. Rebecca's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her face as she opened her car door, not caring about the traffic light that had turned green behind her, not caring about the honking horns or the morning commute that was backing up because of her stopped vehicle. She dropped to her knees on the concrete beside her Tesla, her expensive suit forgotten, and Max, because she could see now that it was definitely Max, launched himself into her arms with a joy so pure it made Steve's chest ache. "Oh God, Max. Oh my God, I thought I'd lost you forever." Rebecca sobbed into the dog's fur, feeling 3 years of grief and guilt and desperate hope finally release their grip on her heart. Steve watched the reunion with a mixture of joy and devastating loss. He'd known this day might come, had sometimes caught Max staring at passing cars with that searching look, had wondered about the faded collar mark around his neck when he'd first found him. But knowing and experiencing were different things entirely. The woman, Rebecca, he now knew from the tags he could see on her key ring, looked up at him through her tears, and Steve saw something in her face that surprised him. Not just gratitude, but recognition of his sacrifice, acknowledgement of what this moment was costing him. "You took care of him," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Look at him, his coat, his weight, his eyes. You took care of him when he needed it most." Steve managed a small smile, though his own eyes were burning. "He took care of me too. More than he'll ever know." A car honked insistently behind Rebecca's Tesla, and she seemed to suddenly remember where they were. She looked at the traffic, at Steve sitting against the concrete pillar with his cardboard bed and worn clothes, at the impossible situation that had brought them together. "I can't just..." She started, then stopped, her mind racing. "We can't just, not after this." Steve understood. The easy thing would be for her to take Max and drive away, back to her life of success and comfort, leaving him with nothing but the memory of 3 years with the best friend he'd ever had. It would be clean, simple, the way these things were supposed to work. But nothing about this moment felt simple. Max seemed to sense the tension between his two humans. He moved back and forth between them, pressing against Rebecca's legs, then returning to Steve's side, as if trying to bridge a gap that couldn't be bridged with simple affection. "There's a coffee shop," Rebecca said suddenly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. 3 blocks from here. Could we talk? Please." Steve looked at her, this successful woman in her expensive suit, asking him to coffee as if they were equals, as if his circumstances didn't make their conversation impossible by every social standard he'd ever known. "Ma'am, I don't think..." "Rebecca," she interrupted. "My name is Rebecca Matthews, and I think we need to have a conversation about what happens next." Another car honked, longer this time, and Rebecca realized she was holding up the entire morning rush hour. But for the first time in 3 years, she didn't care about schedules or efficiency or the opinion of strangers. She had found Max, and in finding him, she'd stumbled into a story that was bigger than just a lost pet returning home. Steve looked at Max, who gazed back at him with those amber eyes that somehow seemed to be asking him to trust this moment, to believe that not all stories had sad endings. "Okay," Steve said quietly. "Okay, Rebecca. Let's talk." The Pike Place coffee house buzzed with the familiar rhythm of Seattle's morning caffeine ritual. But Rebecca Matthews felt as though she existed in a bubble separate from the ordinary world around her. She sat across from Steve Williams at a corner table, Max, lying contentedly between their chairs, his head resting on Steve's worn sneaker, while his eyes remained fixed on Rebecca's face. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. 3 hours ago, she'd been Rebecca Matthews, tech mogul, driving to another high-stakes meeting in her perfectly ordered life. Now she was Rebecca Matthews, woman whose lost dog had just shattered every assumption she'd made about her own story. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up," she said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup for warmth she didn't need. Her business suit felt ridiculous now, the armor of a life that suddenly seemed constructed of tissue paper. 3 years, Steve. 3 years of wondering if he was dead, if he was suffering, if he was looking for me. Steve stirred his coffee slowly, the simple act buying him time to process his own surreal morning. The barista had looked at him with barely concealed suspicion when he'd walked in, his appearance screaming homeless, in a place where lattes cost more than some people's hourly wage. But Rebecca had handled it with quiet authority, ordering for both of them, her presence somehow making him acceptable in a space where he would normally be invisible or unwelcome. "He wasn't suffering," Steve said quietly. "I can promise you that. He was loved." The words hung between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to fully address. Rebecca studied Steve's face, weathered but kind, intelligent eyes that spoke of education and loss in equal measure. This wasn't what she'd expected homelessness to look like, though she realized with shame that she'd rarely given it any thought at all. "Tell me how you found him," she said. "Please. I need to know." Steve's eyes drifted to Max, remembering that cold December morning 2.5 years ago when everything changed. I was sleeping under the I-5 overpass, maybe 6 blocks from here. It was one of those Seattle winters where the rain never stops, and I'd been sick for about a week. Nothing serious, just a chest cold that wouldn't quit when you can't stay warm and dry. He paused, lost in the memory. Rebecca waited, understanding instinctively that rushing would break whatever spell was allowing this conversation to happen. I woke up around dawn, and there was this golden retriever just sitting there, maybe 10 feet away, staring at me. He was thin, not starving, but close, and his coat was matted. There was this mark around his neck like he'd worn a collar, but no collar, no tags, nothing. Rebecca's throat tightened. She remembered that collar, blue leather with Max's name and her phone number, removed only for baths. She'd spent hours the first week calling every shelter, every vet, asking if anyone had found a golden retriever wearing blue leather. He followed me to the community center that morning, Steve continued. I thought maybe someone there would recognize him, or maybe he'd wander off and find his way home. But he didn't. He just stayed, like he'd decided I was his person now. Why didn't you take him to a shelter? Rebecca asked, then immediately regretted the question. It sounded like an accusation when she'd meant it as curiosity. But Steve didn't take offense. I tried. The first shelter I called said they were full, had a 3-week waiting list just to surrender an animal. The second one said they'd take him, but they were a kill shelter, and he'd have maybe 5 days before. He shrugged. I couldn't do that to him. Not when he looked at me like I was the first good thing that had happened to him in a while. Rebecca felt a stab of recognition. That was exactly how Max had looked at her the day she'd adopted him from the rescue organization 4 years ago. Like she was salvation wrapped in human form. So you kept him. He kept me, Steve corrected gently. There's a difference. The distinction mattered, Rebecca realized. It spoke to the relationship she was witnessing between them. The way Max moved naturally between his old life and his current one, claiming both without apology. Steve, she said carefully, can I ask what happened? Before you were homeless. He smiled wryly. It's okay, Rebecca. It's not a dirty word, just a temporary circumstance. He sipped his coffee, choosing his words. I was an aerospace engineer at Boeing. 15 years, good salary, benefits, the whole middle-class dream. Then came the budget cuts in 2021. 300 of us got pink slips on the same Tuesday. Rebecca nodded. She remembered that news cycle. Boeing's struggles had been front-page material for months. But she'd filed it away as someone else's problem. Another corporate story that didn't touch her rarefied world of tech entrepreneurship. Unemployment benefits lasted 6 months. My savings lasted another 4. I kept thinking something would come through. Another engineering job, maybe something in tech since I had programming experience. But I was 41 in an industry that worships youth, and I was competing with guys fresh out of college who'd work for half my previous salary. The matter-of-fact way he recounted his descent made it somehow more heartbreaking than if he'd been bitter about it. Rebecca found herself imagining the stages, the optimism turning to concern, concern to worry, worry to desperation. My sister lived in Portland, Steve continued. But we'd had a falling out years before over our parents' estate. Pride kept me from reaching out until it was too late, and by then her number was disconnected. No forwarding address. He gestured around the coffee shop. So this became my world. And then Max became my world too. Sometimes the most important relationships in our lives come from the most unexpected places. What unlikely friendship has changed your perspective? Tell us in the comments. Rebecca felt the weight of her own privilege settling on her shoulders like a heavy coat. While Steve had been losing everything, she'd been building her empire, complaining about 18-hour days while living in a world where 18 hours without income was a minor inconvenience, not a catastrophe. I need to tell you something, she said suddenly. About the night Max disappeared. Steve waited, recognizing the tone of confession. I was supposed to be home by 7. I'd promised to take him to the dog park. It was his favorite thing, and I'd been working so much that I'd been promising for weeks. But there was this contract, this merger that could have made my company $50 million richer, and the lawyers needed one more revision. Her voice grew quieter, heavy with 3 years of accumulated guilt. I called my housekeeper, Mrs. Chun, and asked her to stay late, to feed Max and let him out in the backyard. She was 73, Steve. 73, and she'd worked for me for 8 years, and I asked her to stay past 9 o'clock because I couldn't tear myself away from making more money I didn't need. Steve saw where this was going, felt the familiar ache of understanding other people's regrets. She forgot to latch the gate properly when she let him back in. Not her fault, she was tired, and it was dark, and she'd already done more than she should have had to. Max must have pushed it open sometime during the night. When I got home at 11:30, he was gone. Rebecca's composure cracked again, tears threatening. I spent the next 72 hours driving every street in Queen and Ballard, Fremont. I hired a private investigator. I put up flyers with a $5,000 reward. I called every shelter in Washington state. But you didn't think to look under the overpasses, Steve said gently. I didn't even know there were people living under overpasses, Rebecca admitted, the confession exposing a blindness that shamed her. Not really. I mean, I knew homelessness existed, but it was abstract, something that happened to other people for reasons I never examined too closely. The silence that followed was heavy with recognition. Two people seeing each other clearly for the first time, understanding how their worlds had intersected without either knowing it. Max chose that moment to shift position, moving from Steve's feet to Rebecca's, resting his chin on her expensive leather shoe. The gesture was casual, natural, as if he was trying to tell them both that love wasn't a finite resource that had to be divided between them. He remembers you, Steve observed, watching the dog's tail thump softly against the coffee shop floor. He remembers you too, Rebecca replied. Look at him. He's not confused or conflicted. He loves us both. It was true. Max displayed none of the uncertainty Rebecca might have expected from a dog torn between two homes. Instead, he seemed perfectly content to exist in this moment where both his humans shared the same space, as if this was exactly what he'd been hoping for all along. Rebecca, Steve said slowly, what happens now? The question hung in the air like a challenge. The obvious answer was simple. She would take Max home to her penthouse, back to the life of comfort and security he'd known before. Steve would return to his concrete pillar, to the community center showers and soup kitchen meals, to a life that was undeniably harder for the loss of his companion. It was the logical conclusion, the socially expected outcome. Rebecca had the resources to care for Max properly: veterinary care, premium food, climate-controlled shelter, all the things money could provide. But as she looked at Steve's face, she saw something that complicated the simple solution. She saw a man who had sacrificed his own comfort to protect an animal he'd found in need, who had shared his meager resources, who had brushed Max's coat with a discarded comb, who had made sure the dog was healthy and loved even when his own life was falling apart. Steve had given Max something Rebecca's money couldn't buy: the knowledge that he was worth saving even when everything else was lost. I don't know, she said honestly. The practical part of me says I take Max home, give you some money for taking care of him, and we both go back to our separate lives. But, Steve prompted. But I've spent 3 years learning that some holes can't be filled with success or money or achievement. And you've spent those same 3 years keeping him alive and happy with nothing but love and whatever scraps you could find. She looked down at Max, who gazed back at her with those amber eyes that held no judgment, only patience. Maybe we both need to figure out what comes next. Steve felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly, but a loosening of the resignation that had become his default setting. What are you suggesting? Rebecca surprised herself with her answer. I'm suggesting that maybe Max has been trying to bring us together this whole time. Maybe him getting lost, and you finding him wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe it was the beginning of a story neither of us knew we needed to be part of. She pulled out her phone, scrolled to her contacts, and showed him the screen. This is my direct number. Not my assistant, not my office me. I want you to think about whether you'd be willing to let me try to repay what you've done for Max by helping you get back on your feet. Steve stared at the number, understanding the magnitude of what she was offering. This wasn't charity. This was partnership, recognition that they both had something the other needed. I'm not looking for a handout, he said carefully. I'm not offering one, Rebecca replied. I'm offering a chance for both of us to figure out how to be the people Max thinks we are. Around them, the coffee shop continued its morning rhythm, but their corner table had become an island where impossible things felt suddenly possible. Max stretched, yawned, and settled more comfortably between their chairs, as if to say that he approved of whatever solution would keep his two humans in the same story. "Can I ask you something?" Steve said. "Anything. Why does this matter so much to you? Beyond finding Max, I mean. You could take him and walk away, and your life would go back to exactly what it was before." Rebecca considered the question, recognizing its importance. "Because exactly what it was before wasn't working," she said finally. "I built a company, made more money than I knew what to do with, achieved every goal I set for myself. But I was lonely, Steve. Profoundly, desperately lonely. Max was the only thing in my life that loved me without wanting something in return." She paused, surprised by her own honesty. "And maybe because seeing you with him showed me something I'd forgotten, that the most important things in life can't be bought or achieved or earned. They can only be given freely, the way you gave Max your protection when you had nothing else to offer." Steve felt the truth of her words settle in his chest. For 2.5 years, Max had been his connection to hope, his reminder that love was still possible even in the darkest circumstances. Now, sitting across from this woman, whose world was so different from his own, he began to wonder if maybe Max's story wasn't ending. Maybe it was just beginning to reveal its true purpose. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's see where this goes." Rebecca smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn in months. "Let's see where this goes." Max's tail thumped approval, and for the first time since either of them had lost everything that mattered, the future felt like something worth looking forward to. The elevator in Rebecca's Queen and high-rise building moved with the whisper-quiet efficiency that only expensive engineering could provide, but the silence between its 3 occupants was anything but smooth. Steve Williams stood rigid against the back wall, his worn clothes and weathered appearance stark against the polished marble and gold fixtures, while Max sat calmly between them, seemingly unaware of the tension crackling through the confined space. Rebecca watched the floor numbers climb, 15, 16, 17, and wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. What had seemed like inspired clarity in the coffee shop now felt like reckless impulse. She was bringing a homeless man to her penthouse apartment, a space so removed from his reality that she might as well be taking him to another planet. "Steve," she said softly as they passed the 20th floor, "you don't have to do this. If you're uncomfortable." "I'm not uncomfortable," he replied, though his knuckles were white where he gripped the elevator's handrail. "I'm just trying to figure out what you're expecting from this." The elevator chimed softly as it reached the 23rd floor, the penthouse level. Rebecca's key card granted access to her private foyer, and the doors slid open to reveal a space that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries to design. Steve stepped out slowly, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Elliott Bay, the carefully curated artwork, the furniture that looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine. Max, however, showed no such hesitation. The golden retriever padded directly to a spot by the windows where afternoon sunlight streamed across polished hardwood floors and settled down with a contented sigh, as if reclaiming a favorite napping spot. "He remembers," Rebecca said, her voice catching slightly. "That was his favorite place to lie in the afternoons." Steve watched Max's easy comfort in these surroundings and felt the full weight of what the past 3 years had cost the dog. Not just comfort, though the difference between a heated penthouse and a concrete underpass was undeniable, but a sense of belonging that Steve had tried to provide but could never fully replace. "This is quite a place," he said, moving to the windows where Max lay basking in the sunlight. The view stretched across the Sound to the Olympic Mountains, a vista that probably never got old for someone who could afford to wake up to it every morning. Rebecca joined him at the windows, suddenly seeing her home through his eyes. "It feels empty most of the time," she admitted. "I bought it because it was supposed to represent success, but I work so much that I barely see it except to sleep." "Success," Steve repeated, the word carrying weight. "What does that mean to you?" The question caught her off guard. In her world, success was measurable: revenue growth, market share, acquisition offers, the respect of peers who controlled their own empires. But standing here with Steve, those metrics felt suddenly hollow. "I used to think it meant independence," she said finally. "Control over my own destiny. Enough money that I'd never have to depend on anyone else for anything. My parents died when I was 19, car accident, and I was determined never to be vulnerable like that again. Steve understood vulnerability, though his had come from different circumstances. So you built walls. I built an empire, Rebecca corrected, then paused. Which I guess are the same thing, aren't they? The honesty of the admission hung between them. Steve moved away from the windows, drawn to a bookshelf lined with business biographies, leadership guides, and strategic planning manuals. Where are the novels? He asked. I don't read fiction, Rebecca replied automatically. No time for stories that aren't real. Stories that aren't real are sometimes the only ones that tell the truth, Steve said, running his finger along the spine of a book about venture capital optimization. It was the kind of observation that reminded Rebecca that homelessness didn't erase intelligence or education. It just made both invisible to people who weren't looking carefully. What did you read before? She asked. When you had a permanent address? Steve's smile was wistful. Everything. Science fiction mostly, but also literature, history, biography. I had this theory that you could understand any culture by reading their stories. Not their newspapers or their business reports, but the narratives they told themselves about who they were and what mattered. Rebecca felt a stirring of something she'd buried under years of corporate focus. Curiosity about ideas that didn't generate revenue. And what story do you think Americans tell themselves? That anyone can make it if they work hard enough, Steve replied without hesitation. That failure is always a personal choice, never a systemic problem. That success is evidence of virtue, and poverty is evidence of moral weakness. The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were accurate. How many times had she unconsciously looked at homeless people and assumed they'd made bad choices, lacked discipline, failed to take advantage of opportunities she took for granted? Is that what you believed? She asked quietly. Before? Absolutely. Steve's laugh held no bitterness, only recognition. I was convinced that my education and work ethic were armor against catastrophe. I gave to charity, but I never imagined I'd need charity. I voted for policies that helped the deserving poor, never questioning who got to decide who deserved help. Max lifted his head from his sunny spot and looked between them, as if sensing the shift in emotional territory. He stood, walked to Steve, and pressed against his legs, not seeking comfort but offering it, the way he'd learned to do during the darkest nights under the overpass. Rebecca watched the exchange and felt something crack open in her chest. Steve, I want to help, but I don't know how to do it without making things worse. What do you mean? She gestured around the apartment, struggling to articulate fears she'd never had to confront before. All of this, the money, the resources, the connections, it feels like a weapon sometimes. I throw money at problems because money is what I understand, but I don't know if that's what you need. Steve considered her honesty, recognizing the complexity of her position. What were you thinking of offering? Rebecca had been dreading this conversation since they'd left the coffee shop. A job to start. My company is always looking for good engineers, and your background in aerospace programming would translate well to our systems architecture department. The salary would be enough to get you into an apartment, buy a car, rebuild the life you lost. It was a generous offer, more generous than Steve had dared hope for. But something in her tone suggested complications she hadn't mentioned. But, he prompted, but I don't know if it's what you want, or if it's just what I think you should want because it's what I would want in your situation. Rebecca moved to her kitchen, a gleaming space of granite and stainless steel that looked barely used, and began making coffee with the kind of expensive machine that suggested someone who took caffeine seriously. I keep thinking about what happens when you show up for work on your first day, and everyone knows you are homeless, and they're all waiting to see if you can handle being normal again. When we try to help others, how do we know if we're truly serving their needs, or just making ourselves feel better? What's the difference between charity and genuine support? Share your thoughts below. Steve felt the truth of her concerns settle heavily in his stomach. Corporate culture was unforgiving of weakness, and homelessness, regardless of circumstances, would always be seen as a personal failing by people who'd never faced systemic catastrophe. You're worried about your reputation too, he said, not accusingly, but with understanding. Rebecca's hands stilled on the coffee machine. Yes, she admitted. And I hate that I'm worried about it, but I am. Rebecca Matthews, who built her company from nothing, taking on charity cases. Some people will see it as admirable, but others. She shrugged. Others will see it as evidence that I'm getting soft, making decisions based on emotion instead of logic. And in your world, emotion is weakness. In my world, emotion is expensive. Steve walked to the kitchen island, accepting the coffee she offered him. The beans were probably worth more per pound than he'd spent on food some weeks, but the gesture felt natural now, less fraught than it had in the coffee shop. "Rebecca, can I tell you something that might surprise you?" She nodded. "I don't want my old life back." The statement hit her like cold water. "What do you mean?" Steve sipped his coffee, choosing his words carefully. "The life I had before, the house, the car, the career, the whole middle-class package, it was built on assumptions that turned out to be false. That hard work guaranteed security. That success was permanent. That people who failed somehow deserved it." He moved back to the windows where Max had returned to his patch of sunlight. "These past 3 years have been the hardest of my life, but they've also been the most honest. When you have nothing, you learn what actually matters. Community. Kindness. The way a dog can keep you sane when everything else falls apart." Rebecca felt her carefully constructed plan beginning to crumble. "So you don't want the job?" "I didn't say that." Steve's smile was gentle but firm. "I'm saying I want a job that means something, not just a paycheck that lets me pretend the last 3 years didn't happen. I want to work with people who understand that success and failure aren't moral categories, they're just temporary circumstances." "And you think that's possible? In corporate America?" "I think it's possible with you," Steve said simply. "Because you've spent 3 years learning the same lesson I have, that the things money can't buy are the only things that really matter." Rebecca stared at him, feeling the truth of his words resonate in spaces she'd forgotten existed. Max chose that moment to stand up, stretch, and walk to his old food bowl, still in its place by the kitchen island, kept there as a shrine to hope Rebecca had never acknowledged. "I kept everything," she said quietly, following Steve's gaze to the bowl, the toys scattered in a basket nearby, the leash hanging by the door. "Mrs. Chen wanted to put it all away after the first month, said it was too painful to look at. But I couldn't let her. It felt like giving up." "You weren't giving up," Steve said. "You were keeping faith." The words settled between them like a bridge, connecting her 3 years of grief to his 3 years of survival, both of them sustained by the same golden retriever, who now looked expectantly between his bowl and the humans discussing his future. "He's hungry," Rebecca realized. "God, I've been so focused on us that I forgot." She opened a cabinet that revealed an impressive stockpile of premium dog food, treats, supplements, all waiting for a return that had seemed increasingly impossible with each passing month. As she filled Max's bowl, Steve noticed something that made his chest tighten. Every bag, every can, every package of treats was the same brand Max had eaten during their years together. The expensive kind that Steve had splurged on during his better weeks at soup kitchens, when donated goods included pet supplies. "You knew what he liked," he said. Rebecca looked up from where she knelt beside Max, watching him eat with the single-minded focus of a well-loved dog. "I paid attention to what you were feeding him." The shelter posts photos of donated supplies on their website, and I started contributing the brands I saw him eating in pictures people posted online. Steve felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of this woman. "You were taking care of him through me." "I was taking care of both of you," Rebecca corrected quietly. "I just didn't know it at the time." The admission hung in the air, revealing a connection that went deeper than coincidence or simple gratitude. For 3 years, without knowing it, they had been partners in caring for the same vulnerable creature, each providing what the other couldn't. "So what happens now?" Steve asked, echoing his earlier question, but with different weight behind it. Rebecca stood up, brushing dog food crumbs from her expensive suit, and looked at him directly. "Now we figure out how to build something that honors what we've both learned. Not your old life, not my isolated life, but something new that makes space for the people we've become. And if it doesn't work, if corporate culture chews me up and spits me out, if your board thinks you've lost your mind, then we'll figure out something else," Rebecca said with a certainty that surprised them both. "But we'll figure it out together. All 3 of us." Max looked up from his bowl, tail wagging, as if he'd been waiting his entire life for these 2 humans to finally understand what he'd known all along. That some families aren't born, they're built, one act of faith at a time. But even as the moment felt like resolution, both Rebecca and Steve knew the real challenges were just beginning. The corporate world that had shaped Rebecca's success wasn't known for its tolerance of unconventional arrangements, and Steve's re-entry into professional life would require navigating prejudices neither of them could fully anticipate. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade, casting longer shadows across the penthouse, and with the approaching evening came the weight of decisions that would determine whether this fragile new partnership could survive the harsh realities waiting outside Rebecca's protected world. Max finished his meal and returned to his sunny spot, but his contentment couldn't quite mask the uncertainty that hung over all their futures like a storm cloud that hadn't yet decided whether to break. The Matthews Tech Solutions boardroom occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Columbia Center, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Seattle's skyline that was designed to intimidate. Rebecca Matthews sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, her usual position of power, but today the familiar setting felt like a trap. "Rebecca, we need to discuss your recent decision-making," said James Hartford, the board's lead member and longtime family friend, who had helped her secure her first round of venture capital funding 8 years ago. His tone carried the carefully modulated disappointment of someone who had watched her build an empire and was now questioning her judgment. The other 7 board members sat in strategic positions around the table, successful executives from various industries who had invested not just money, but their reputations in Rebecca's vision. Today, their faces reflected a mixture of concern and barely concealed frustration. "What decision-making are you referring to, James?" Rebecca asked, though she knew exactly what had prompted this emergency meeting. News traveled fast in Seattle's tight-knit business community, and her coffee shop conversation with Steve 2 days ago had apparently not gone unnoticed. "Don't play naive with us," interjected Sandra Chen, the board's newest member and former Microsoft executive. "You've been seen multiple times with a homeless man, and according to our sources, you're considering bringing him into the company as an employee." Rebecca felt her jaw tighten. She'd expected resistance, but the clinical way Sandra reduced Steve to a homeless man ignited something protective in her chest. "His name is Steve Williams. He's a former Boeing aerospace engineer with 15 years of experience and a master's degree from the University of Washington. He's also the person who kept my dog alive for 3 years when I couldn't." "We understand your gratitude," James said carefully, "but gratitude and sound business decisions are different things. This company employs over 300 people whose livelihoods depend on your ability to make rational choices. And what exactly is irrational about hiring a qualified engineer?" "The optics, Rebecca." Sandra leaned forward, her voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining obvious truths to a stubborn child. "Matthews Tech Solutions has built its reputation on innovation, efficiency, and excellence. What message does it send to our clients when they discover we're hiring people off the streets?" "It sends the message that we value competence over circumstances," Rebecca replied, but she could feel the room's energy shifting against her. "Does it?" asked Michael Torres, the board member who oversaw human resources policies. "Or does it send the message that Rebecca Matthews makes decisions based on personal emotion rather than professional judgment? That her leadership has become compromised?" The word hung in the air like an accusation. Rebecca had built her company by being ruthless when necessary, pragmatic always, and emotionally detached when it served the bottom line. The board had chosen her precisely because she could make hard decisions without sentiment interfering with profit. Now they were seeing sentiment, and it terrified them. "I want to read you something," Rebecca said, reaching for her phone. "Steve Williams designed the guidance systems for the 787 Dreamliner's emergency protocols. His code has been tested in over 200 simulated crisis scenarios and has never failed. Boeing's internal review rated his work as exceptional for 7 consecutive years." She looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes. "This isn't charity. This is recognizing talent that the system overlooked." "The system didn't overlook him," Sandra said bluntly. "The system determined he was expendable during necessary restructuring. That's how capitalism works, Rebecca. If every company hired back everyone they've ever laid off, the entire economy would collapse." Rebecca felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was the worldview she'd operated from for years, the logic that had built her fortune. Success meant making hard choices, and hard choices meant accepting that some people would be casualties of economic necessity. But that was before she'd seen Steve's gentle hands brushing Max's coat with a discarded comb. Before she'd watched him share his meager breakfast without complaint. Before she'd understood that the system was just a collection of individual choices made by people who could afford to never face the consequences. "What if I told you," Rebecca said slowly, "that hiring Steve Williams isn't about charity at all? What if it's about building the kind of company that doesn't just extract value from the world, but actually adds value to people's lives?" "I'd say you sound like a freshman sociology student, not a CEO," James replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Rebecca, we've all admired your vision, your drive, your ability to turn ideas into profit. But this isn't vision, this is guilt talking." "Maybe guilt is just clarity wearing work clothes," Rebecca shot back, surprising herself with the metaphor. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken ultimatums. Board meetings were usually collegial affairs, discussions among allies working toward common goals. This felt like a trial. "Rebecca," James said finally, "we need to know that you're still capable of putting the company's interests first. That your judgment hasn't been affected by recent personal experiences." The careful phrasing didn't disguise the threat. Rebecca understood corporate power dynamics well enough to recognize a vote of no confidence when she heard one being constructed. "And if you decide it has been, then we'll need to discuss leadership transitions," Sandra said smoothly. "For the good of the company and all its stakeholders." Rebecca stared around the table at faces she'd once trusted, people she'd considered allies in building something meaningful. Now she saw them clearly, guardians of a system that had made them all wealthy by ensuring that wealth remained concentrated among people exactly like themselves. "I need some air," she said, standing abruptly. "We'll continue this discussion tomorrow." She left the boardroom before anyone could respond, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floors as she walked toward the elevators. But instead of going down to the parking garage, she pressed the button for the roof. The building's rooftop garden was her private retreat, a small patch of green in the sky where she came to think through difficult decisions. Today, the late afternoon wind carried the scent of approaching rain, and the mountains were barely visible through gathering clouds. She pulled out her phone and dialed Steve's number, the burner phone she'd bought him yesterday, so they could stay in contact. "Rebecca." His voice was cautious, as if he'd been expecting bad news. "Where are you right now?" "The library. I was researching your company, trying to understand what I'd be walking into." He paused. "How did your board meeting go?" "About as well as you'd expect," she said, sinking onto one of the stone benches she'd had installed when she'd bought the building. "Steve, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Okay, what do you want?" "Not what you think I want to hear, not what seems most reasonable or practical. What do you actually want your life to look like?" The question was met with silence, and Rebecca could almost hear him thinking through the implications of complete honesty. "I want to work on something that matters," he said finally. "I want to get up in the morning and know that what I'm doing makes the world a little bit better, not just a little bit richer. I want to be around people who understand that failure and success are temporary conditions, not permanent character judgments." He paused, and she could hear the sounds of the library around him. Keyboards clicking, pages turning, the quiet hum of people pursuing knowledge for its own sake. "And I want to do it with people I trust. People who've seen me at my worst and still believe I have something valuable to offer." Rebecca felt tears sting her eyes. "Steve, what if I told you I was thinking of walking away from all of this? The company, the board, the whole empire I've built. I'd ask you what you want to build instead." The simple response cut through 3 years of accumulated exhaustion, the weight of board meetings and profit projections, and the constant pressure to grow faster, earn more, dominate markets that didn't need dominating. "I want to build something that helps people instead of exploiting them," she said. "Something that creates opportunities instead of just extracting value. Something that proves business can be a force for good instead of just a machine for accumulating wealth." "That sounds like a company I'd want to work for," Steve said quietly. Rebecca stood up, pacing to the edge of the rooftop, where the city spread out below her like a circuit board of lights and possibilities. "Steve, what do you know about social enterprises? Companies that measure success by impact instead of just profit?" "I've read about them," but I've never worked for one. That's because there aren't enough of them, Rebecca said, her mind beginning to race with possibilities that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. What if we change that? Matthews Tech Solutions has contracts worth $47 million. I own 60% of the company outright, and my personal assets are worth about $38 million more. She paused, letting the numbers settle. What if we took all of that and built something completely different? Something that used technology to solve problems for people who can't afford current solutions. Steve was quiet for so long that Rebecca wondered if the connection had dropped. Rebecca, he said finally, are you talking about walking away from everything you've built? I'm talking about walking towards something better, she corrected. Something that honors what Max taught us both. That taking care of each other isn't charity. It's just what decent people do. The wind picked up, carrying the first drops of the promised rain, and Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The thrill of uncertainty, the electric anticipation of stepping into unknown territory without a safety net. There's something else, she continued. Something I haven't told you yet. What? 3 days ago, I was Rebecca Matthews, successful CEO, living a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt empty from the inside. Today, I'm Rebecca Matthews, woman who found her dog, and maybe found herself in the process. She wiped rain from her face, not caring that her expensive suit was getting soaked. I don't want to go back to who I was before, Steve. I want to become someone better. What exactly are you proposing? Rebecca took a deep breath, committing fully to the leap of faith that had been building since their first conversation in the coffee shop. I'm proposing we start over. Both of us. I'll liquidate my position in Matthews Tech, and we'll use that capital to build a new kind of company. One that creates jobs for people the system has written off. One that develops technology solutions for problems that don't have wealthy markets behind them. One that proves you can be profitable and ethical at the same time. Sometimes the biggest risk in life is playing it safe. What would you do if you had the chance to walk away from security to chase a dream that could change everything? Tell us in the comments. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of rain beginning to fall in earnest. Rebecca realized she was holding her breath, waiting for Steve's response to an offer that would change both their lives irrevocably. Rebecca, Steve said slowly, you're talking about giving up everything you've worked for, everything you've achieved. Your board was right about one thing. This is a massive risk. The biggest risk I've ever taken, she agreed. But also the first one that feels like it's worth taking. And if it fails? If we can't make it work? If we lose everything? Rebecca thought about the question seriously. If their venture failed, she would go from being a multi-millionaire to what? Someone starting over. Someone who'd had everything and lost it chasing an idealistic dream. Someone not unlike Steve. Then we'll figure out what comes next, she said, echoing her promise from their first conversation. Together. She heard him take a shaky breath on the other end of the line. Rebecca, I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we really do this, I won't be your charity case or your redemption project. I'll be your partner. Equal stakes, equal voice, equal responsibility for whatever we build. I wouldn't want it any other way. And if the business world tries to tear us apart, if they use our past against us, if they say you've lost your mind and I'm just a homeless man who got lucky. Rebecca looked down at the city below, at the lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness, at the lives and dreams and struggles playing out in countless windows and offices and homes. Then we'll prove them wrong by building something so undeniably good that their opinions become irrelevant. Steve laughed, actually laughed, and the sound carried more hope than Rebecca had heard in any boardroom presentation about projected quarterly growth. You realize, he said, that what you're describing isn't just a business plan. It's a revolution. Maybe it's time for a revolution, Rebecca replied. Maybe Max brought us together because the world needs more people willing to risk everything to take care of each other. She walked back toward the rooftop entrance, shaking rain from her hair, feeling lighter than she had in years despite the magnitude of what she was contemplating. Steve, are you still at the library? Yeah. Can you meet me at my apartment in an hour? I want to show you something. What? The business plan I started writing at 3 o'clock this morning when I couldn't sleep because I kept thinking about what kind of company would hire both of us exactly as we are. When she ended the call, Rebecca realized she was smiling, genuinely smiling, for the first time since Max had disappeared 3 years ago. The rain was falling harder now, and she was thoroughly soaked, but she felt more awake than she had in years. Tomorrow, she would face her board and make the announcement that would either cement her reputation as a visionary leader or destroy her credibility forever. She would liquidate her life's work to fund a dream that might fail spectacularly. But tonight, she would go home to her penthouse where Max was waiting, and she would show Steve Williams the blueprint for a company that measured success not by stock prices, but by the number of people it helped build better lives. Tonight, she would take the first concrete step toward becoming the person Max had always believed she could be. The elevator doors opened, and Rebecca stepped inside, her soaked suit leaving puddles on the polished floor. But for the first time since she'd built this empire, she felt like she was finally heading in the right direction. 6 months later, the warehouse in Georgetown buzzed with an energy that Rebecca Matthews had never experienced in all her years of corporate success. Unlike the sterile quiet of her old office building, this space thrummed with genuine productivity. Keyboards clicking, voices engaged in passionate problem-solving, the occasional burst of laughter that came from people who actually enjoyed each other's company. Rebecca, the Seattle Housing Authority just approved our pilot program, called Maria Santos, their newest hire, a former Amazon engineer who'd left her 6-figure salary to join their mission. 15 transitional housing units will be equipped with our job-matching software by the end of the month. Rebecca looked up from her laptop, where she'd been reviewing applications for their expanding team. And the partnership with the community college? Finalized this morning, Steve replied from across the room, where he sat surrounded by 3 monitors displaying code that would help homeless individuals access services through a simple smartphone interface. They're integrating our platform into their job training programs starting next semester. 6 months ago, this scene would have been impossible to imagine. Rebecca Matthews, former tech mogul, working from a converted warehouse with a team of 12 people, most of whom had been written off by traditional corporate America. Steve Williams, former homeless engineer, serving as chief technology officer of a company that existed to prove that everyone deserved a second chance. Their venture, which they'd named Bridges Tech Solutions, had grown from Rebecca's 3 a.m. brainstorming session into something that was transforming not just their own lives, but the lives of hundreds of people across Seattle. "How are we doing on the Henderson Foundation grant?" Rebecca asked, stretching in her chair. The furniture here was functional rather than luxurious, recycled office equipment they'd bought from companies upgrading their spaces, but somehow it felt more comfortable than the designer pieces in her old boardroom. "They're flying in next week for the final presentation," Steve said, saving his work and walking over to where Rebecca sat. "But honestly, I think we've already proven the concept works better than anyone expected." He was right. In 6 months, their job-matching platform had helped 127 people find sustainable employment. Their transitional housing software had reduced the average time between temporary shelter and permanent housing by 43%. Their financial literacy app had helped over 400 individuals build credit and savings accounts for the first time in years. More importantly, they'd proven that hiring people based on potential rather than just credentials could create a workforce that was not only competent but genuinely invested in the company's mission. "Steve, do you remember what you said in the coffee shop that first day?" Rebecca asked, saving her own work and giving him her full attention. "About stories that aren't real being the only ones that tell the truth." "Vaguely," he said, though his smile suggested he remembered exactly. "I think we're living one of those stories now. The fairy tale about the homeless man and the millionaire who found each other through a golden retriever and built something beautiful together." Steve looked around their warehouse office, taking in the sight of their diverse team working on projects that would never make them billionaires, but would make the world measurably better. "Except this one is real." "The best stories usually are," Rebecca replied. Max chose that moment to emerge from his favorite napping spot, a dog bed positioned strategically between Rebecca's and Steve's work areas where he could keep both his humans in sight. At 4 years old, he'd settled into his role as chief morale officer with the dignity of someone who knew his worth. The warehouse workers adored him. Visitors inevitably asked about the handsome golden retriever who seemed to own the place, and his presence somehow made every meeting feel more human. "Speaking of stories," Steve said, reaching down to scratch Max's ears, "I got a text from James Hartford this morning." Rebecca's eyebrows rose. James, her former board member, had been one of the most vocal opponents of her decision to leave Matthews Tech Solutions. The last time they'd spoken, during her dramatic resignation 6 months ago, he'd predicted she would be bankrupt and begging to return within a year. What did he want? "He wants to meet. Says he's been following our progress, and he has a proposition." Rebecca felt a familiar wariness settle in her chest. In her experience, propositions from people like James usually involved someone trying to buy, control, or co-opt whatever success you'd managed to build independently. Did he say what kind of proposition? "He wants to invest. Not just money, he wants to help us scale nationally. He thinks Bridges Tech could be the model for a new kind of socially responsible venture capital fund." The irony wasn't lost on Rebecca. The man who'd questioned her judgment for helping Steve now wanted to profit from the company they'd built by helping people like Steve. "What did you tell him?" "I told him we'd discuss it," Steve said carefully, "but that any investor would have to understand that our mission isn't negotiable. We're not interested in growing just to grow. We're interested in growing to help more people." Rebecca studied Steve's face, recognizing the thoughtful way he approached complex decisions. 6 months of partnership had taught her to trust his instincts, just as it had taught him to trust hers. They'd learned to complement each other's strengths and compensate for each other's blind spots. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think James Hartford represents everything we walked away from," Steve said honestly. "But I also think he's got resources that could help us reach people we can't reach from one warehouse in Seattle. The question is whether we can take his money without compromising our values." Before Rebecca could respond, Maria Santos appeared beside their desks, practically vibrating with excitement. "You two need to see this," she said, holding up her tablet. The story just went live. Rebecca and Steve gathered around the screen, where a Seattle Times headline read, "From homelessness to high tech, the unlikely partnership transforming Seattle's approach to employment." The article, accompanied by a photo of Steve and Rebecca working side by side in their warehouse office with Max lying contentedly between them, told their story with a depth and nuance that surprised Rebecca. Rather than sensationalizing the dramatic elements, the journalist had focused on the practical impact of their work and the innovative approach they'd developed. "Listen to this quote," Maria said, scrolling to the middle of the article. "What Rebecca and Steve have proven is that talent and dedication aren't distributed along economic lines," said Dr. Sarah Chen, director of the University of Washington Center for Social Innovation. "Their model demonstrates that companies can be profitable while prioritizing people over pure profit maximization." Steve read over Rebecca's shoulder, both of them taking in the article's description of their hiring practices, their technology solutions, and the measurable outcomes they'd achieved in just 6 months. "There's more," Maria continued, scrolling to the end. "They interviewed some of our employees." Rebecca's heart clenched as she read testimonials from team members whose lives had been transformed by the opportunity to work for a company that valued their contributions regardless of their past challenges. David, a former addict who designed their user interface. Carmen, a single mother who'd been homeless for 2 years before becoming their customer service manager. Marcus, a veteran with PTSD who developed their data security protocols. "This is going to change everything," Rebecca said quietly. "In a good way or a bad way?" Steve asked. Before Rebecca could answer, her phone began ringing with calls from reporters, investors, and competitors who'd apparently been following their work more closely than she'd realized. The story had clearly struck a nerve in a business community increasingly pressured to demonstrate social responsibility alongside profitability. "Both," she said finally. "We're about to get a lot more attention than we're used to. Sometimes the most powerful changes happen not through grand gestures, but through quiet consistency and the courage to live according to your values. What small step could you take today to make your corner of the world a little better? We'd love to hear about it in the comments." Over the next several hours, the warehouse buzzed with reporters, photographers, and curious visitors who wanted to see the company that was being hailed as a new model for ethical business. Rebecca and Steve found themselves giving impromptu tours, explaining their philosophy, and demonstrating the technology they'd developed. But the most meaningful moment came late in the afternoon, when an elderly black woman appeared at their door, clutching a worn newspaper clipping. "Excuse me," she said tentatively. "I'm looking for Steve Williams." Steve looked up from the interview he'd been giving to a local news crew, and immediately stepped away when he saw the woman's face. "Can I help you?" She smiled, and Steve felt his heart stop. "You probably don't remember me, but I'm Dorothy Williams. I used to live at 1247 Cedar Street in Portland." Steve's knees nearly buckled. "Duh, my sister Dorothy." "Hello, baby brother," she said, opening her arms. The warehouse fell silent as Steve crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, wrapping his sister in an embrace that lasted several minutes. Rebecca watched from across the room, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the reunion she hadn't known Steve needed. "How did you find me?" Steve asked when they finally separated. Dorothy held up the newspaper clipping, the Seattle Times article. "I've been looking for you for 2 years, ever since I got clean and found out what happened to you at Boeing. I hired a private investigator, but we could never get a current address. Then this morning, I saw your picture in the paper, and I knew I'd found my brilliant big brother." Rebecca approached quietly, not wanting to intrude, but unable to stay away from such a powerful moment. "Dorothy," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion, "this is Rebecca Matthews. She's the person who helped me remember who I could be." Dorothy looked at Rebecca with the shrewd assessment of someone who'd survived her own share of hardships. "You're the woman who started this company with my brother?" "We started it together," Rebecca corrected gently. Steve's vision and expertise made it possible. Dorothy studied both their faces, clearly recognizing something in their partnership that went deeper than professional collaboration. And the dog, Max, as if summoned, appeared from his napping spot and approached Dorothy with the calm confidence of a dog who'd learned to read people accurately. "This is Max," Steve said. "He's the reason Rebecca and I met. He belonged to her, got lost, and I found him. Or maybe he found me. We're still not sure which." Dorothy knelt down, letting Max sniff her hand before scratching behind his ears. "Sounds like this dog has been taking care of both of you." "He has," Rebecca agreed, "in ways we're still figuring out." As the afternoon light began to fade, the warehouse gradually emptied of visitors and reporters, leaving just the core team to process the day's events. Dorothy had accepted Steve's invitation to stay for dinner, and Rebecca found herself cooking for a group in the small kitchen they'd installed in one corner of the workspace. It wasn't fancy, pasta and salad, bread from the bakery down the street, but as she looked around the table at faces that had become family over the past 6 months, Rebecca felt a contentment that all her corporate success had never provided. "So what happens now?" Maria asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. "After today, everything's going to be different." "Different how?" Steve asked. "More attention, more pressure, more people who want to either copy what we're doing or prove it can't work on a larger scale." Rebecca considered the question while Max settled at her feet under the table, his presence a reminder of how unexpectedly life could change direction. "I think," she said slowly, "that we do exactly what we've been doing. We help people, we build good technology, and we prove every day that business can be a force for healing instead of harm." "And if James Hartford wants to invest?" Steve asked. "Then we listen to what he has to offer, and we make sure any partnership serves our mission instead of undermining it," Rebecca replied. "We've learned to trust our instincts. If something feels wrong, we say no. If it feels right, we move forward carefully." Dorothy, who'd been listening quietly, spoke up. "Can I ask you something, Rebecca?" "Of course. What made you walk away from all that success to do this? I mean, I understand why Steve needed a new start, but you had everything." Rebecca looked across the table at Steve, then down at Max, who gazed back at her with those amber eyes that had started this entire journey. "I had everything money could buy," she said finally. "But I didn't have anything that money can't buy. Purpose. Connection. The knowledge that my work was making the world better instead of just making me richer." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Steve and Max taught me that success isn't about accumulating wealth. It's about using whatever resources you have to take care of each other." "And now?" Dorothy asked. Rebecca looked around the table at these people who'd become her chosen family, At the warehouse that had become more of a home than her penthouse had ever been. At the work that got her up excited every morning instead of just getting her up. "Now I have everything that actually matters," she said. "And we're just getting started." As if to punctuate her words, Max stretched out completely under the table, his body touching both Rebecca's and Steve's feet, physically connecting the two humans who'd found each other through loving him. Outside, Seattle's evening lights began to twinkle, and inside the warehouse, 8 people and one very satisfied golden retriever settled in for an evening of planning the next phase of their unlikely revolution. The fairy tale was real, and it was just beginning. The stage at the Seattle Center was larger than Rebecca had expected, the bright lights making it difficult to see the audience beyond the first few rows. But she could feel their attention, their curiosity about the woman who'd walked away from millions to start over with a homeless man and a golden retriever. "When I was invited to give this TED Talk," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium sound system, "I was told to speak about innovation in social entrepreneurship. But I realized that what we've built at Bridges Tech isn't really about innovation. It's about remembering something we never should have forgotten." In the front row, Steve sat with Max at his feet, both of them providing the steady presence that had become Rebecca's anchor in a year full of speeches, interviews, and presentations. Dorothy sat beside them, beaming with pride at her brother's transformation from homeless man to nationally recognized social entrepreneur. "We've forgotten that every person has value that can't be measured by their current circumstances," Rebecca continued. "We've forgotten that failure is temporary, but compassion is permanent. We've forgotten that the most successful businesses are the ones that succeed by helping other people succeed." The slides behind her showed images from their first year. The warehouse office, their diverse team, testimonials from people whose lives had been changed by their programs. But the image that got the strongest response was a simple photo of Steve and Rebecca working at adjacent desks, with Max sleeping peacefully between them. "My dog Max disappeared 3 years ago, and I thought I'd lost him forever. But Max wasn't lost. He was finding the person I was supposed to meet, the partner I needed to build the work I was supposed to be doing. Sometimes what looks like loss is actually just love taking a longer route to get where it needs to go." Rebecca paused, finding Steve's eyes in the front row, seeing the pride and affection that still surprised her with its depth. Today, Bridges Tech Solutions operates in 12 cities, has helped over 2,000 people find sustainable employment, and has proven that companies can be profitable while prioritizing people over pure profit. But more importantly, we've proven that everyone deserves a second chance, and that the best way to find your own purpose is to help someone else find theirs. The applause was thunderous, but Rebecca barely heard it. She was looking at Steve, at Dorothy, at Max, at the family she'd never expected to find in a chance encounter under a freeway overpass. After the presentation, as they walked through Seattle Center toward the parking garage, Dorothy linked arms with both Rebecca and Steve. "You know what I love most about your story," she said. "What's that?" Rebecca asked. "It proves that sometimes the best thing you can lose is the life you thought you wanted, so you can find the life you were meant to live." Max trotted ahead of them, his leash loose in Steve's hand, leading the way with the confidence of a dog who knew exactly where home was and exactly who belonged there with him. Behind them, the lights of Seattle stretched out like possibilities, and ahead of them, the future waited with all the patient promise of a golden retriever who'd always known that love was the only navigation system anyone really needed.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.